Early in the morning, Delilah got out of bed. Trying not to make noise, she threw on a robe, shivering from the cold, and quietly left the bedroom. Chuck was indifferent to the cold. He always opened the window at night, even if it was freezing outside. He couldn't sleep in the heat. When Delilah complained about being cold, he just chuckled and suggested she cover herself with an extra blanket. Delilah closed the bathroom door behind her more tightly. The blue tiles glistened in the light of the bulb. Yesterday, Delilah had scrubbed them for a whole hour with a sponge. Chuck didn't like stains or water droplet marks. Turning on the hot water tap, Delilah realized she had to wait for the water to heat up. She washed up and only then looked into the mirror. 35. Can't escape it. For her age, Delilah looked very good. But Chuck, her husband, teased her about the wrinkles around her eyes and her slight plumpness. "Oh, Delilah, where can I find a beauty like you? I'd marry you on the spot if I met you," Mr. Tucker, the factory's technician, would say. Delilah blushed and replied, "Mr. Tucker, look at all the young and slim ones around. Why would I want someone skinny?" The man wondered. A woman should be. And he drew curves in the air. Delilah laughed and hurried back to her department. She worked as a manager at a furniture factory, where she had met her husband, Chuck. He was a truck driver, delivering goods. A tall, handsome guy. She liked him immediately. Delilah and Chuck had volunteered together during one of the city's festivals and were paired up. "Hey, you two!" A cheerful shout came. Delilah and Chuck turned simultaneously, captured by Peter, a local newspaper photographer. Delilah, with a round face and dimples on her cheeks, looked at him with big gray eyes, and her light brown locks fluttered in the wind. Chuck, dark-haired and tan, smiled widely. Delilah secretly admired them, and even when he asked her out, she couldn't believe Chuck had noticed her. He courted her modestly, but Delilah, who grew up without a father, felt happy, whether it was just walks in the park or a simple bouquet of daisies. He might not speak beautiful words or carry her around the house, but with him, Delilah felt protected. So, without hesitation, she agreed to marry him. "Delilah, let's get married and buy," Chuck would say. Of course, Delilah didn't marry Chuck for an apartment. It was just that she felt secure and happy with him. A man of few words and a homebody. He didn't run off to the bar every weekend. He saved money, aiming to buy a car. They mostly lived on Delilah's salary. But did they need much more? At least for the two of them. Delilah smiled with happiness, and soon there would be 3 of them, and maybe even 4. It was time to think about children. Delilah looked with slight envy at acquaintances whose kids were already growing up. She wanted a son, someone resembling Chuck, and then a daughter, who would resemble her. They had a modest wedding. Chuck's parents had passed away, and he was raised by his aunt. However, she also died when he joined the army. Delilah, on the other hand, only had her mother, who lived far away in a small village. She sent a congratulatory letter and invited them to visit to get to know her son-in-law. "Is he treating you well, Delilah? Not abusive, not a drinker? If he misbehaves, just divorce him and come back here. I'll always welcome you. We'll figure something out," worried her mother wrote in the letter. Delilah wiped away tears. "Mom, dear Mom," almost forcibly, she was sent on a train after school to a faraway city, so her daughter could attend college. Her mother saved money her whole life, sacrificing everything for herself. She dreamed of Delilah living and working in the city, not getting stuck in the village. Still, Delilah warmed her heart, knowing how much her mother loved her. 10 years had passed since the wedding. On her first vacation, Delilah went with Nikolai to her hometown. She hoped Mrs. Woodruff would become like a mother to him, as he had become an orphan so early. But it didn't happen. They couldn't find common ground. Chuck couldn't accept the rural way of life. "I came on vacation, not to work," he grumbled while lying in the garden hammock. "And you're making me fix the fence and the roof." Once, he did fix something, only because he overheard gossip from neighbors. They laughed at him. Local men looked at him with curiosity. He's a strange one. Doesn't have a drink with them, keeps to himself, and doesn't help around the house. Mrs. Woodruff was so excited about her son-in-law, bragging that an assistant would come. Delilah tried to talk to Chuck, but he only got upset and then stopped talking to her. "Don't bother him, dear," her mother comforted Delilah, patting her shoulder. "He's an unusual person, not used to the city." Delilah was grateful that her mother didn't blame her and, as always, looked into her eyes with softness and love. Later on, she couldn't go home every year. Chuck was satisfied. Delilah cried, but she was afraid to defy her husband. How could she go alone? And she felt guilty. A child didn't come. Not after a year, not after 2. The doctor in the consultation room just shrugged and advised her to have her husband checked. But as soon as Delilah mentioned it, Chuck got angry and said, "You are telling me to go to the doctor with such a question?" "No, but, Chuck, the doctor says both of us need to get checked." Delilah replied, "I'm fine. You deal with it yourself." Chuck responded. Her mother hid her illness for a long time, writing that her health was fine, promising to visit, trying not to worry Delilah. But unexpectedly, a letter arrived from the neighbors. They had to go to the funeral. Chuck hesitated for a long time but couldn't refuse. After all, it was his wife's grief. Besides, what would people say? Delilah barely emerged from the grave. She clung to the loose clay, stroking her mother's portrait incessantly. They had to sell the family home, and Chuck took the money for himself. By that time, he had plans to buy a 2-bedroom apartment. He wanted space, including a separate bedroom. He opted for factory furniture, bypassing the stores. Delilah created coziness and beauty, always dreaming of how well a child's bed would fit. Yet, the house remained without the sound of children's laughter and the pitter-patter of little feet. Nonetheless, they continued to live, work, went to the movies on weekends, and watched television in the evenings. But it pained Delilah's heart more and more when she saw happy parents with children on the screen. "I don't know what's wrong." Another doctor shrugged, examining her results. "According to the tests, everything is fine." Delilah lowered her head and walked home, intentionally avoiding the daycare center. "Chuck, maybe we can adopt a child?" she asked once. "What?" Chuck asked, tossing the newspaper aside. Standing up. "Never," he replied. "I will never raise someone else's child, and you need to get that thought out of your head." "But, Chuck, those children are just like any others," Delilah whispered. "We can adopt a little one, and he won't even know he's not our biological child." "Delilah, you're supposed to be a grown woman, not talking such nonsense. Do normal children get rejected?" "No. We don't even know who his real parents were. In short, I don't want to hear any more of this." Every month, Delilah lived with hope for a few days, listening to herself, catching fleeting changes. She rejoiced if she felt a bit nauseous, but nothing happened. In the end, she almost resigned herself. What could she do? Fate, it seemed, had its own plans. Yet, she still looked with resentment at her neighbor from the first floor, Sandy. A large woman, giving birth almost every year, and all from different men. It seemed even she couldn't remember how many children she had. The older ones had moved away. Others lived in a boarding school and only came home on weekends. The little ones she quickly placed in a 24-hour daycare. And still, she was always seen with an old squeaky stroller and a couple of children. Meanwhile, Delilah cried at night, praying for just one. Nina, her friend, consoled her. "Oh, Delilah, don't cry. Tears won't help." One day, she suggested, "Listen, maybe you should divorce Chuck. I think it's him. Why won't he go to the doctors? When I couldn't get pregnant in the first year, My Bruce immediately went to the doctor. Nina, round, important, and cozy, resembled a bun. Beautiful, indeed. Huge black eyes, vibrant lips, and a resonant voice that both her husband, Bruce, and 2 children feared. Bruce, shorter, lean, and hunched, worshipped his wife and submitted to her in everything. Nina appeared stern at first glance, but in reality, she deeply loved her unimpressive Bruce, the prankster Otis, and the capricious Simona, who grew up as a carbon copy of her mother. Or go on a vacation, have a little affair, and Nina continued. Nina, Delilah interrupted her. You know I can't do that. I know, Nina said. She looked at her friend with sympathy, not knowing how to help her, and Delilah was grateful for this warmth. Now, standing in front of the mirror in the bathroom, Delilah seemed to see all 10 years she had lived with Chuck. She gazed into her gray eyes and furrowed her brow. In 3 days, she would be leaving for the health spa resort. There was a need to prepare and freeze food for Chuck, not accustomed to household chores. Chuck was used to having Delilah handle everything. He was very upset when she informed him of her trip. Why do you need this? I need to recuperate there. Delilah justified herself. And are you sick? Seems not. Just say you want a break from home. He felt offended. In the accounting office, Pamela was radiant with happiness. She also struggled to get pregnant for a long time until she went to the new health spa resort. She relaxed, underwent treatment, and now she was preparing to go on maternity leave. Delilah questioned Pamela about this place and then decisively went to the doctor. Try it, Delilah. Of course, give it a try, the doctor suggested. So, for the first time in many years, Delilah decided to go somewhere alone, without her husband. Initially, she thought he wouldn't allow it, but Chuck grumbled a bit and then calmed down. Okay, go. Just prepare some food. Delilah took a shower, sadly surveyed her imperfect body, and sighed. Not only did the extra kilograms refuse to leave, but she was also infertile. But there was no time for sadness. She had to hurry to prepare breakfast for Chuck. In the morning, Delilah boarded the train, and within a day, she was supposed to arrive in a small cozy town where the picturesque resort was located. She didn't take many things with her. Chuck couldn't accompany her. He had to go to work. After breakfast, he awkwardly kissed Delilah on the cheek and jokingly admonished her. Keep an eye out there. What? Where? Delilah looked surprised at her husband, who unexpectedly pointed his finger at her with embarrassment. During the trip, Delilah settled by the window. It was late autumn, and the trees had already shed their colorful attire. The compartment was warm, with an elderly woman sitting nearby and a taciturn, grumpy man. He slept almost the entire way, then woke up and went to the restroom. He returned refreshed, with water-drenched hair. Delilah noticed that his hair was gray, mixed with black, creating a very unusual effect. Excuse me. The man suddenly smiled. I slept the whole day. I was sent on a business trip straight from the night shift. He continued to justify himself. Delilah was surprised. Why should she care? Well, he sleeps, and it doesn't bother or engage her in conversation. Well, nothing, she replied. Sleeping on the train is great, that's for sure. The man smiled again, and Delilah noticed how he transformed. It was as if he had become 10 years younger. He smiled widely, and his gray eyes sparkled. My name is Eric. And yours, Delilah, she replied and turned away towards the window. By that time, it had already darkened, and outside, only white lights occasionally passed by the window. Delilah suddenly felt so sad. Where was she going? Why? She longed to be home with Chuck in the familiar environment. Delilah, would you like some tea? I love having it in the evening. I also have fresh cookies. Her new acquaintance asked. Did your wife bake them? Delilah asked with a smile. No, not the wife. Bought them fresh from the bakery this morning. He looked at her with an imploring expression. and for some reason, she agreed. It was awkward to refuse, and she felt like having a snack. They drank tea for a long time. She had no desire to sleep. The cookies turned out to be delicious. They sat and talked. Eric shared how he became a widower 5 years ago and lives with his teenage son. He works as a mechanic in the workshop, goes on business trips, passes on his experience, and Mrs. Packer, the neighbor, looks after his son. Delilah listened attentively. She liked the sound of his voice. She felt sorry for Eric, being alone. She shared almost nothing about herself, only mentioning that she was going to the resort for 3 weeks, and the kids. At home with their father, Delilah blushed, shook her head, and then suddenly said angrily, "It's late. It's time for a nap," as she started to unravel her long, thick hair. "You, Delilah, look like a mermaid," Eric quietly said. Delilah didn't reply, covered herself with a blanket, and turned to the window. Eric sighed heavily and stared into the dark window, lost in his thoughts. All the lightness with which Delilah interacted with Eric yesterday suddenly disappeared. Delilah took out her suitcase and froze, staring at the unfamiliar station the train was approaching. "Delilah, excuse me if I offended you," Eric suddenly said. "We're from the same town. I wrote down my work phone here, just in case. Don't think anything strange. Take it." His voice was soft but insistent. Delilah took the piece of paper. It wasn't difficult for her. She glanced at the number, and at the bottom, it said, Eric Parker. The train stopped. Delilah smiled, said goodbye, and quickly exited. Eric stepped onto the platform, but Delilah was no longer there. The health spa resort turned out to be very large, consisting of several buildings. Delilah looked around in confusion and, noticing the signs, headed towards the main building. She was quickly received. Her documents were checked. Delilah filled out a questionnaire and, receiving a sheet with the daily schedule and procedures, went to her room. After lunch, she had to see the doctors to plan her treatment. She was accommodated on the 3rd floor. Delilah worked on a soft red carpet, peering into rooms with identical light brown doors. "Here is 314. Turning the key in her hand, she knocked just in case. Steps were heard inside, and the door swung open. In the doorway stood a tall, curly blonde. She looked around 30. She wore a short pink satin robe, revealing slender long legs. "Hello," Delilah greeted with a friendly smile. "I'm your roommate." The blonde woman looked her up and down, then grinned widely. Delilah noticed her large white teeth, like those of a horse. "Hello. Come in," said the woman. "I was wondering who they'd put in with me. I was afraid they'd stick me with some country woman. My room would smell like cows then." She laughed. Delilah entered. The room was ordinary: 2 wooden beds, 2 nightstands, a small table by the wall, and chairs nearby. The windows were tightly closed, and the room was warm. Delilah was pleased. "I'm Clara. Here's your bed. Where are you from? What treatments are you here for?" her roommate asked. Delilah couldn't keep up with the questions. Clara seemed friendly, but also too talkative and intrusive. Surprisingly, they both found out they were from the same town. Clara worked as an administrator in a museum, but dreamed of a higher position. "Oh, lunch is in 10 minutes. Come, I'll show you around," Clara said. Her blue, round eyes, doll-like, dimmed. The black mole above her upper lip twitched. "Everything's useful. Lean, eck. But I work in the park nearby in the evenings. You can take a stroll and grab a hot dog." Delilah envied Clara's figure, slim and toned. "What are you here to treat? Women's issues?" Clara asked as they went for lunch. Delilah blushed and nodded silently. "Oh, come on. Don't be upset. They'll fix you up, and you'll be good as new." "Really?" Delilah naively asked. "I hope so," she thought. Still, Clara appealed to her. The modest and quiet Delilah was glad that her roommate turned out to be so bold. Maybe they would become friends and continue to communicate when they returned. Delilah wondered if Clara would like Nina. "How long have you been here?" Delilah asked her new friend. "It's been 10 days already." Clara nodded. "Honestly, I'm getting tired of this place. I'm thinking of going home earlier. I'll stay for another week." And then, she waved her hand. "Missing your husband?" Delilah smiled. "I've just left, and I already miss mine," she admitted. "My husband. Haven't found the one I'd want to marry yet," she said, "although there are plenty of contenders." Clara said. Delilah smiled. She had never met a woman who didn't want to get married. Next to her, she felt so mature and dignified. "I do have one friend, though," Clara smirked. "I really like him." "Do his like you back?" Delilah asked. Clara raised her perfectly arched eyebrows. "He's not indifferent either," she replied. "He says he loves me, although we don't get to see each other often. But when we do, we can't get enough of each other, even in the car." She chuckled shyly, and a blush appeared on her cheeks. The days passed smoothly, one after another. Delilah followed all the doctor's recommendations, firmly believing that her visit here would bring positive results. She woke up early, went to the large gym for a workout while Clara slept. Later, Delilah took a shower, and together with Clara, they headed to breakfast. "I prefer toasted toast and coffee in the morning. Not this," Clara would say, looking at the healthy menu at the resort. After breakfast, Delilah strolled around, explored the different buildings, and greeted other people at the resort. Clara, however, preferred to lounge in the room, flipping through fashion magazines. She quickly grew tired of the doctor's recommendations. "I came here to relax, not to undergo treatment," she often complained. Delilah was amazed. Clara applied makeup early in the morning and wore it all day. In the evening, she even added glittering eyeshadows, all for a casual walk around the resort. Clara's slender figure in a gray jacket resembled that of a model, and her pink shoes attracted attention. "Do you like it?" "I bought it recently," Clara said, noticing Delilah's admiring gaze. "My beloved gave me the money. Isn't he sweet?" Delilah chuckled. It's nice when people have feelings. Several times, Clara invited Delilah to join her activities, but she always declined. "I've been married for many years. It would be boring for you to be with me," she explained. Delilah stayed in her room, reading a book. One day, Clara returned early, locked the door, and, with brightly painted eyes, winked at Delilah. She pointed to the table and then pulled out a bottle of cognac from the bag. Delilah raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Sit down, my friend. Let's have a drink. Let's talk about us. Look at these beauties," Clara said, gesturing toward 3 orange balloons. "Oranges," Delilah exclaimed, "and here's more." Clara reached into her bag and pulled out a bar of dark chocolate. "Delicious. Come on, put away your book." Delilah shook her head. "No, Clara, I don't like this. Besides, I'm not allowed." Clara burst into laughter and uncorked the bottle. After pouring a bit into the glasses, she took an orange and started peeling it. Then she broke the chocolate into pieces. "Please." Clara made an inviting gesture, and Delilah understood that refusal was not an option. "Well, just a little," she agreed, afraid to offend her friend. The bitter liquid burned Delilah's tongue. She winced and reached for a slice of orange. Cheeks flushed, feeling the heat. Clara poured another portion. As much as Delilah resisted, she had to drink it too. Her head was starting to spin. "Do you love?" Clara suddenly asked, looking intently at Delilah. "Love what?" Delilah was taken aback. "Your husband," Clara said. Delilah found herself lost in thought. For some reason, all sorts of nonsense began creeping into her mind. Memories of arguments and Chuck's rudeness resurfaced, especially his accusation that it was her fault they didn't have children. Delilah felt hurt, and she unexpectedly started confiding in Clara. Clara listened attentively, sighed, and poured more brandy. It was particularly painful to talk about the challenges of having a child, and Delilah even found herself in tears. Clara comforted her, claiming that all men were selfish. She cited her own beloved, who provided money and passion but never proposed. "But you don't want to get married?" Delilah recalled. "No, I don't." Clara tossed her curls. "Well, maybe I do," she suddenly said. "But he's terrible." As the moon peeked through the curtains into the room, observing the two women who had long been asleep, a partially consumed bottle of brandy sat on the table. The next morning, Delilah woke up with a headache and couldn't even go to the workout. She remembered Clara complaining. What had come over her? She couldn't bear to look at the brandy bottle. Delilah scolded herself. She had never drunk so much before. Fortunately, Chuck wouldn't find out what she had been up to. She suddenly felt ashamed. Meanwhile, Clara acted as if nothing had happened, laughing, teasing Delilah about her green face, and urging her to take a stroll to feel better. Yet, the next day, Clara unexpectedly announced her plan to go home. "Clara, really, maybe you could stay a bit longer." But Clara shook her curls. "No, that's enough. I have other, more exciting things to do." Delilah felt both disappointed and relieved. Clara's behavior had been unsettling. Delilah wasn't accustomed to such companionship. Before leaving, Clara left the museum's phone number on a piece of paper. "Call me when you are back. Don't disappear." Delilah nodded, hugged Clara, determined not to lose the note, and decided to tuck it away in her purse. Her fingers stumbled upon a folded rectangle with Eric's phone number written on it. Delilah held the paper, smiled, but for some reason, she didn't throw it away. Instead, she carefully put it back. After Clara's departure, Delilah found solace in the peace of being alone. She continued to follow the doctor's recommendations, no longer disrupting the routine. Each step brought her closer to the long-awaited day when she would have a child. Delilah missed Chuck and thought of him with a smile. He wasn't rude. He was just a serious man. When she returned, she decided to bring him a gift, a blue shirt. Everything would work out for them, and they would have a son or a daughter. 4 days before leaving the resort, disturbing news spread. One of the buildings was quarantined, and all guests were advised to undergo tests and disperse. Delilah followed suit. She didn't want to be around infections. She worried about not being able to exchange her ticket, but luck was on her side. She found a spot on the train. Her heart beat rapidly to the rhythm of the wheels. Home, home. Chuck would be surprised. Perhaps he'd take a day off, and then they could spend 3 days together. Maybe go to the movies or visit the museum where Clara worked. Fleeting memories of Eric crossed Delilah's mind. Where was he now? She remembered the delicious cookies he used to treat her with and sighed discreetly. She hadn't lost weight at the resort. She had hoped to impress Chuck. However, the main thing was for her to have a child. The thought of giving birth for the first time at her age frightened her, but she dismissed these thoughts and urged herself to focus on the positive. She might be 35, but there was still time, and the child would come. She just needed the Lord's help. The city greeted her gloomily, rain falling steadily. Delilah scanned her surroundings as if searching for someone. Even though she understood there was no one to meet her, she decided not to disturb her husband and planned a pleasant surprise for him. The bus took a while to arrive, and Delilah was freezing, dreaming only of getting home for a warm cup of tea. She finally boarded the bus. The ride was long, but she gradually warmed up. Here was her stop. The cold wind swirled around her. She shivered, but soon she'd reach the corner, and then she'd be home. She entered her apartment building, familiarly checked the mailboxes, grabbed a newspaper, and smiled, thinking Chuck was probably still sleeping. Delilah ascended the stairs, inserted the key, pushed the door, and the dim light in the hallway greeted her. The apartment was quiet. Delilah cautiously placed her suitcase on the floor and unbuttoned her coat. "Phew, it's good to be home at last," she whispered. Something on the floor in the faint morning light caught her attention. Again, Chuck probably scattered his shoes around. He never puts them in their place. She shook her head and turned on the light. Stunned, Delilah stared at the floor as if she had seen a venomous snake. Her bewildered gaze shifted to the coat rack, and she fixated on a gray jacket hanging there. Glancing down, pink shoes with a small heel stood before her. Delilah pressed both hands to her mouth, as if afraid to scream. Her heart pounded, and her knees trembled. There was no doubt. Clara, her neighbor at the resort, wore such a jacket and shoes. Delilah sank onto the chair by the entrance. Her head buzzed and exploded, and she lacked the strength to proceed further into the apartment. She couldn't even cry. Unexpectedly, the water started dripping loudly from the tap in the kitchen, and this sound snapped Delilah out of her stupor. She rose abruptly and walked towards the bedroom door. Her heart thumped furiously. Delilah closed her eyes, pushed the door with trembling fingers, and the curtains in the bedroom were tightly drawn, making it hard to see who lay in their bed, Chuck and someone else. It was stuffy in the room, and the familiar sweet scent lingered in the air. Delilah's eyes gradually adjusted, and she silently prayed to someone unknown, hoping it was all a mirage, a mistake. Perhaps, when she looked more closely, she would find only Chuck in bed, annoyed at being woken up early. But reality proved to be more painful. In the bedroom, Delilah discerned both her husband's dark-haired head and Clara's curly head, sound asleep. With Clara leaning on Chuck's shoulder, Delilah felt nauseous. A spasm twisted her stomach, leaving her breathless with pain. She surveyed the room. Clara's dress hung carelessly on a chair, and Chuck's pants were scattered on the floor. A black stocking lay on the carpet beside the bed. Delilah recoiled, as if danger lurked around her. With a loud thud, she stumbled over an empty champagne bottle. Clara stirred, stretching, and hoarsely said, "Chuck, Chuck, something's making noise over there." Chuck grumbled and reluctantly opened his eyes. Spotting Delilah, he stared at her as if he had seen a ghost. "Delilah," he said. His eyes darted, and his hands nervously clutched the blanket. Delilah locked eyes with Clara's round, terrified gaze. Panic-stricken, Clara silently moved her lips, frantically shifting her gaze from Delilah to Chuck. "Delilah, you see, he stammered. "It's all." Clara remained silent, clutching the blanket to her chest. Delilah, equally silent, turned away and rushed out of the bedroom. Swallowing tears, she ran through the wet streets, stumbling over stones, dotting into unfamiliar courtyards. Finally, she stopped and surveyed her surroundings. Everything was as usual. People hurried to work. Children went to school. Old ladies worked their dogs. The world hadn't collapsed. Everyone had their own affairs and problems. Only Delilah couldn't comprehend how to go on. Inside, it hurt as if someone had slashed her soul with a knife, shattered it into tiny pieces. She reached a bench on the boulevard, sat on the wet planks, curled up as if trying to become invisible. How is this possible? Delilah clenched her fists so hard that her nails dug into her skin. Her mind cleared a bit. She didn't feel the cold or rain. A slight tremor shook her entire body, but Delilah remained motionless. She didn't understand what to do now, where to go, and how to live. "Dear," she suddenly heard from beside her. "Dear, you're all frozen. You'll catch a cold. Is it okay to sit in a puddle?" Opposite her stood a small old lady, all dressed in black, as if in mourning. "Something happened to you?" she asked Delilah. Delilah looked at her, blinked, and suddenly burst into tears. The old lady recoiled in fear, waving her hands. Delilah jumped up, covering her mouth with her hands, and ran to the only place where she could find sympathy and silent support right now. She ran to Nina's house. "What a jerk!" Nina exclaimed loudly. "Don't cry. she said irritably to Delilah. "He's not worthy of your tears." Nina seemed eager to let out a string of curses, but, glancing around and noticing the curious eyes of children, she held back. "Bruce," she shouted, "why are you still here? You should have left a long time ago. Is it so challenging to handle all this without me?" She needed to take her daughter to kindergarten, and Otis needed to be escorted to school. Nina usually took care of it, but today she wasn't up to it. Half an hour ago, when she opened the front door, she didn't immediately recognize Delilah. A trembling woman with wet hair and pale lips stood before her. She clung to the wall as if she might faint. "Delilah," Nina shouted, "what happened? Tell me, is something wrong with Chuck?" But Delilah could only shake her head and sob. Nina took hold of Delilah, embraced her shoulders, and led her inside. Seating her on a chair, Nina removed Delilah's wet coat and then guided her into the bathroom. There, without asking anything more for now, Nina undressed Delilah and put her under a hot shower. Her friend seemed unlikely to be able to say anything at the moment. "Bruce, make some tea," she called towards the kitchen. Delilah, trembling, wrapped herself in a soft, oversized robe. A fragrant tea steamed in a large mug. Nina gave her friend a stern look and reached for a small dark bottle. Pouring a tablespoon of the brown liquid, she stirred it into the tea. "Drink. Come on," she said. Delilah obediently took a sip and choked. The scent of brandy reminded her of that evening when she poured her heart out to Clara. Tears welled up in her eyes. Humiliation and hurt warmed her face. Nina immediately hugged her shoulders and pulled her close. "I'd kill that Chuck. Crush him with one blow, like a fly." When Delilah calmed down a bit and managed to tell who exactly ended up in bed with her husband, Nina's eyes widened in amazement. "Too bad I'm far away. I'd have torn out all her hair, that wretch." "How did she manage to do that?" Nina said. "A long time, Nina. They've been together for a long time," Delilah replied. Nina frowned, and Delilah began to tell her how lately she had noticed that Chuck's mood often changed. Sometimes he was gloomy, and then suddenly he'd come home cheerful, even bringing a small gift. A month ago, he gave her a wristwatch, small and very beautiful. Delilah admired them, always indifferent to clothing. He unexpectedly bought 2 new shirts, then a swamp-colored coat and a brown hat. A couple of times, he stayed late at work, citing car troubles that needed fixing. And when she pressed against him at night, he would sigh and move away. "Oh, I'm tired. I have no strength. Let's just sleep." Clara told me that she's been in love with her friend for 6 months. Delilah continued. "Oh, if only I knew who this friend was. It's disgusting." Delilah covered her face with her hands and sobbed. "Clara's a rat. In general, Delilah, you'll stay with me tonight. Got it? I'm off to work, and in the evening, I'll head straight home. And you, right now, will lie down here." She pointed to the couch. "And try to sleep. Understand?" "I won't sleep, Nina," Delilah said. "Then lie down, read, and don't leave the house. Who knows, you might go back to your Chuck," Nina said. Delilah sat on the couch like a large rag doll. "I'll leave early," Nina promised. "We'll figure out what to do, although, well, what is there to think about?" Nina waved her hand and left. Delilah looked at her in fear. What did she mean? Divorce. But how? So many years. Delilah shuddered and grimaced. Despite standing in the shower for a long time, it still felt like a barrel of dirt had been dumped on her, and she couldn't wash it off. The memory repeatedly flashed images of Chuck and Clara lying next to her in bed. Delilah groaned and buried her face in the pillow. Curled up, she stared into space for a long time, recalling how she and Chuck got married, how they lived all these years. She wondered where and when she had made a mistake, pushing her husband into someone else's arms. She also remembered Clara's smooth, well-groomed body, her slender waist, long legs, thickly mascaraed long lashes. She understood why Chuck chased her for youth and beauty. Suddenly, Delilah slapped herself on the thighs. "It's my fault. All mine. How many times did Chuck tell you to lose weight? That he didn't like Clara's plumpness? And what did she do? And now she's complaining." Delilah pulled a thick blanket over herself, feeling cold. Unconsciously, she drifted off to sleep. She had a strange and terrifying dream. It seemed she was walking barefoot through a snowy field, sinking into drifts, emerging, and looking ahead. There was only a white, boundless desert to the horizon. Suddenly, under her feet, she heard a crack. Delilah looked down and saw cracks spreading. She was no longer in the field, but on a river. One of the cracks widened. Now, in front of Delilah, there was black water. In a moment, she plunged into the depths. Gasping, she tried to escape, but the ice dragged her under. Delilah pressed her face against the transparent surface, saw the dim sun, sought air, but the thick layer of ice was too hard. And then, Delilah began to scream from terror and pain, from despair and hopelessness. While the sun kept shining, she woke up from her own scream, bewildered, scanning the room. Where was she? She remembered being at Nina's. She remembered how she ended up here. Her heart squeezed again. Delilah lay still, enduring, getting used to it. Around 5 in the evening, Nina returned. She anxiously surveyed her friend, noticing the blue shadows under her eyes and the extinguished, miserable look. What to do with her? Nina quickly warmed up soup and made Delilah eat a few spoonfuls. Delilah always liked how Nina cooked, but today the food seemed tasteless. Nina sat beside her. The pity for her friend tore at her soul. How can I help? What can I do? She would have kicked her husband out of the house right away. But Delilah won't be able to do that. Chuck is like a shining light to her. Someone knocked on the door. Nina raised her eyebrows in surprise and left the kitchen. Unlocking the door, she blushed with anger. Chuck stood before her. "Is Delilah here?" he asked, immediately averting his gaze. "What do you want?" Nina asked. Chuck glanced at her powerful figure, grimaced. He never liked this Nina. Too big, too noisy. And where do they come from? How does Bruce live with her? He feared that Delilah might also get so fat. That's why he reminded her to take care of herself. "I need to talk to her," Chuck said, taking a step forward. Nina folded her arms across her chest. Chuck realized he wouldn't be allowed into the apartment and stepped back. He stood there, chin up. After all, it was their family matter, and they would figure it out somehow without interference. "Get out of here," Nina said, pushing Chuck and slamming the door. She listened. It seemed quiet. Then, from the kitchen, Delilah rushed into the hallway. "Is that Chuck? Chuck? Did he come?" Nina glared at Delilah. Delilah ran to the bathroom, quickly changed, and rushed to the door. "Let me out, Nina, let me out," she shouted. "Don't judge, please. I can't handle it." And she ran out of the apartment. Nina sighed and sat on a chair. "Oh, what a fool. What can you do with her? She'll burn out, and you won't even gather ashes. That's Delilah for you. Kind, vulnerable. She doesn't know how to stand up for herself." Nina understood that her friend wouldn't listen, sighed. All that remained was to pity her and help. Delilah ran out onto the street and immediately ran into Chuck. He stood by a wet bench. Seeing Delilah, he said, "Let's go home. We'll talk there." And they walked towards home. Delilah listened to herself. What did she want? She realized she only wanted one thing: for Chuck to repent, say that everything with Clara is over, and then they'll start anew, and maybe they'll have a child after all. She was ready to forgive him, just to end it and return to the way things were. The apartment was tidy. If Delilah hadn't seen Clara here with her own eyes, she would have never thought that another woman had been in her home. She was afraid to enter the bedroom. Clara's scent haunted her. Chuck sat in the room at the table. Delilah sat on the couch, looking at her husband plaintively. waiting for him to say something. "Delilah, you see, I don't know how it happened," Chuck said. "I was on a resort with her," Delilah whispered. Chuck grimaced. He knew Clara had told her everything. Such coincidences happen. He didn't believe his ears when he heard it, and she was shocked when she saw Clara. He had hidden, tried to keep it a secret, but it still came out. Chuck glanced at Delilah. "How long have you been with her?" Delilah suddenly asked. Chuck pursed his lips. Why did she need to know that? In spring, they took them to the museum for some exhibition. Chuck found it all uninteresting. Kept checking the time, waiting for it to end. Then she walked into the hall. Beautiful. The dress hugged her incredibly, and her legs with sharp knees. The curls flowed, and when she looked at him with those blue eyes, his heart skipped a beat. Things between them spiraled so quickly. It's not like he wanted to cheat on Delilah, but it happened. She kept going to doctors, talking about having a child constantly, and Chuck felt like he was just an empty space or meant only for reproduction. Also, those round knees. How many times he asked her to lose weight. Clara's figure lingered in his mind. And those legs. Those legs tormented him. They haunted his eyes. Unlike Delilah, Clara was fiery. One thing about Clara annoyed him: she loved money. She complained incessantly, talking about things she saw in the store and how much she wanted to dress up. Chuck had to dip into the family budget. Then guilt began to torment him. He had to buy small gifts so Delilah wouldn't suspect anything. It became a tangled mess. He thought about breaking up with Clara, ending these affairs. But as soon as he saw her, the desire to embrace her and kiss her hot lips overwhelmed him. He thought, all right, by New Year's, they'll surely part ways. But then everything came to light. Maybe it's for the best. Before leaving, Clara asked, "What are we going to do now, Chuck?" He didn't answer her. What to do? Everything suited him. At home, there was a wife, comfort, and on the side, there were passions. With Delilah, there was habit, stability, and with Clara, there were hot embraces, kisses, and the feeling that he was still young and capable of much. He needed them both. That's why he stayed silent when Clara asked if he would get divorced. Then it was time to stall. He urged her to wait, thinking he would get tired of it himself. But every time, after a few days, he'd start imagining her legs and lips again. Delilah moved quietly. Chuck glanced at her. For a moment, he felt sorry for her. So many years together. Unlike some wives, she doesn't nitpick. Compared to Nina, she wasn't even overweight. Maybe it really was all about the child. If there were a son, everything would be different. Chuck sighed. These women, only problems. He looked at Delilah again, sighed, and moved closer to her on the couch. Delilah flinched, straightened her back. Tears filled her eyes. Chuck cleared his throat and began, "Delilah, if you can, forgive me. I don't know what got into me." He smirked, realizing how foolish it sounded. Was he a little boy? Didn't he understand what he was doing? No, he did. Delilah needed to be reassured. Otherwise, Nina might convince her to get a divorce. "I'm guilty before you. Delilah, guilty. You probably won't even want to look at me now. I got tangled up. You know, it all piled up somehow. I'm loaded at work. You're constantly counting days and running to doctors. And I feel like I'm not needed by you. I wanted a child. Chuck, our child," Delilah whispered. Chuck hung his head. He felt ashamed, not for the affair, but for having to apologize. He had never done that before. But he needed to calm Delilah down. "I understand, Delilah," he said. "I also want a child to play football with. And remember, you said I should see a doctor too. Well, I'll go. Tell me where to go. And it's over with Clara. I promise you everything. Just forgive me. Okay?" Delilah turned her head. Was Chuck really repenting? She thought he would gather his things and leave for that impossibly beautiful Clara. Instead, he was apologizing. And he was even willing to see a doctor. And if we can't have a child, Chuck said, we'll adopt. We'll raise the child. Because what's most important for a child, right? The example of parents. And you and I are great examples. We? Delilah asked. Is there still we? Certainly, Delilah. Otherwise, why would I have come looking for you in the rain? I've been thinking all day, sitting behind the wheel, and you've been on my mind. But how? It's over with her, Chuck replied. Today, I told her it's done. I don't need anyone else but you, Delilah. After all, I love you. Delilah wiped away tears, feeling relief and joy in her heart. Chuck rarely spoke of his love for her, and she had almost given up hope of hearing it again. Despite this, an unpleasant feeling lingered in her soul, the haunting image of Chuck with Clara. Yet, the fear of losing Chuck was overwhelming. She loved him. Chuck cautiously embraced her shoulders. Delilah didn't pull away, but remained frozen, as if coiled into a ball. Please, Delilah, Chuck pleaded. And it's true. Everything with Clara needs to end, he thought, sensing the warmth of his wife beside him. Had fun. That's enough. Delilah stood up. What should she do? How to make a decision? Delilah lay separately on the couch, unable to approach their bed. Clara's image with exposed shoulders kept haunting her. Sleep eluded her. Sorrowful thoughts swirled in her mind. She pondered how to pretend that nothing had happened and prepare breakfast for Chuck. Now we could have gone to the movies, then to a cafe, and tomorrow we could have dressed warmer and gone to the park. How to get rid of this disgusting feeling? Delilah sadly thought. Chuck didn't leave. On the contrary, he kept peeking into the room. Delilah, do you want me to go for cake? We can have tea, he suggested. Delilah shook her head. Chuck disappeared, but half an hour later, he reappeared at the door. Delilah, I've prepared dinner. Come, let's eat. Again, Delilah couldn't force herself to move. The next evening, the doorbell rang. Delilah startled, looking into the hallway. Could it be Clara again? Hearing Nina's voice, she rushed to her. You look really bad, Nina said, ignoring Chuck, who stood nearby, watching Nina jealously. Get dressed, Nina told Delilah. Let's go for a walk. Have you eaten? Delilah shook her head. I see. Come on. What are you waiting for? Get dressed, I say. It's warm outside. Wait a minute. Chuck interfered. What's all this ordering around? Nina didn't pay attention, focusing only on Delilah. Indeed, I'll go for a walk. I can't stay here in the same apartment with him, thought Delilah. 10 minutes later, the friends stepped out onto the street. How are you, Delilah? Nina asked. I don't know, Nina, Delilah replied. Chuck said yesterday that he would end things with her, promised to see a doctor, and even mentioned adoption. Oh, really? And what about you? Nina responded. Delilah shrugged. She felt ashamed before her friend for not kicking Chuck out, not causing a scene, and not making him grovel at her feet. It's embarrassing. Oh, so embarrassing. All right, Delilah, don't be upset. Let's see if he keeps his promise. Meanwhile, let's go eat. Returning home, Chuck was not there. Delilah's heart sank immediately. With Clara again, he's running around. That's how it will be now, running around. She fell face first into the pillow, holding her head in her hands. How painful, how painful. Betrayal would now stand between them. How to live with this? How to come to terms with it? There was a knock on the door. Delilah listened. Chuck entered the hallway and peeked into the room, holding a bouquet of chrysanthemums. Delilah loved their tangy and bitter scent, associated with those rare moments when her husband showed her attention. That's why the aroma meant so much to her. Chuck looked guilty, and Delilah noticed with pity how he had slimmed down in these days. He still cares, she thought. She stood up, hands hanging by her sides, waiting for Chuck to speak. Delilah was afraid to meet her husband's gaze, not wanting him to see her pain. Let him think she didn't care. Delilah, he finally said. Forgive me, Delilah. Red patches appeared on his tan cheeks. His hands trembled, and he looked apologetic. He held out the flowers, but Delilah didn't take them. Chuck sighed and lowered his hand. That's how my happiness withered, Delilah thought, silently moving away to the window. Chuck sat on the couch. From the beginning, he knew this flower stunt was foolish, an attempt to justify himself to his wife. He couldn't think of anything else. How else to show Delilah that he didn't want to part with her? How to atone for his guilt? And why did he bring Clara home in the first place? But she was so tempting. Even now, at the most inconvenient time, Clara appeared before him with her legs and slender waist. Delilah, think about it. So, I made a mistake. What now? Execute me. It's life. And do I not have a life? Delilah said, and she cried, wiping tears off her cheeks. Chuck winced, as if he had been hurt. No, today the conversation wouldn't work. Autumn came. The first snow fell. Delilah woke up, prepared breakfast, silently went to work, returned, had dinner, and went to bed. She slept separately from Chuck, never able to return to the marital bed. Chuck tried to talk several times, and Delilah even seemed to have forgiven him. But as soon as he tried to touch her or kiss her, she froze. He felt it and became even more frustrated. Well, she's pushing me away herself, he thought. He didn't visit Clara anymore, and she didn't contact him either. When visitors came to the museum, Clara anxiously scanned the crowd, hoping Delilah wasn't among them. She really didn't want a scandal in public. Deep down, she knew Delilah wouldn't go anywhere too proud and modest. Yet, it was still unsettling. Chuck's heart, too, felt empty. Just an ordinary man, nothing special. Yet everything pulled him toward Chuck. Could it be that she had truly fallen in love? A month passed, and Clara grew increasingly nervous. Chuck never showed up once. Could he really value that plain girl more than her? She scrutinized herself in the mirror. How could he trade her for that shapeless, quiet mouse? Delilah doesn't even have a spark in her eyes, always talking about kids. If she laughs, it's quietly. She speaks so little, not like a woman, but like a pitiful mouse. And something seemed off with her health, Clara suspected. Did the last night spent with Chuck at his apartment have consequences? Was she scared and nervous? Clara hesitated. Dealing with these complications was unnecessary, and she pitied her figure. She considered going to the doctor to make sure and take measures before it was too late. But then she thought, Chuck's apartment is nice. Maybe Delilah will leave altogether to avoid seeing her ex-husband's happiness. Clara, in her place, would definitely leave. Twirling in front of the mirror, examining her still flat stomach, Clara unexpectedly froze. What if Chuck isn't happy about it? What if he rejects her? What if he doesn't believe the child is his? She looked at herself with frightened, round eyes. Oh, I can't procrastinate. I need to talk to Chuck immediately. Clara dressed up, went to his workplace, the factory. Walking there, she contemplated. It turns out the child will be born at the end of summer. She needs to marry Chuck by then. The child can be sent to a nursery afterward. And after a year, send the child to mother in the village. She has nothing else to do, and the grandson or granddaughter will grow up in the fresh air. Well, she and Chuck will live for their pleasure. They'll go to the seaside, sail on a yacht, drink cocktails, visit museums, or just sunbathe. And they won't need anyone else. Clara daydreamed so much that she almost missed Chuck. He walked out confidently, and you couldn't tell he was almost 10 years older. Warmth spread in her chest. She was still fond of Chuck. Chuck, she called. Chuck turned around, scanning the surroundings, and walked towards her. He grabbed her elbow painfully and dragged her aside. why did you come here?" he asked. He certainly didn't want Delilah to see him now. She'd never forgive him. They slept separately, as if they were already divorced. He was angry. She's so stubborn. Maybe he's wasting his time with her for nothing. But something stopped him from getting a divorce. He pitied the apartment, the atmosphere, and most of all, the thought of losing convenience and comfort scared him. "Chuck, why?" Clara tried to pull her arm away. "You disappeared somewhere. You don't come. And I'm waiting." She smiled and flitted her eyelashes, knowing how effective it was on men. Chuck blushed and turned away. Clara stood in a short coat, with incredibly beautiful legs. "Let's go," Chuck said, and walked down the street. Clara followed him. They reached the nearest cafe, and Chuck ordered tea. "Chuck, enough. What have you decided? Did you silently run away like this without bothering to tell me?" Clara suddenly said. Chuck took a sip of tea and choked. He coughed, and Clara immediately approached, patting him on the back. Chuck nodded. Clara stood next to him, pressing her body against him. Chuck's head spun. The sweet scent of perfume reminded him of the moments of their passion. "Clara," he said, "you know, it's all complicated." "What's complicated?" Clara asked. "Did you fall out of love with me and decided to back out?" She sobbed, and her eyes filled with tears. Chuck was tired of women's tears. He tried not to think that he was the one at fault. "Chuck," Clara whispered, "you can't leave me. I'm going to have your child." Chuck looked at her face with astonishment. Clara gazed at him with round, trusting, and frightened eyes. That look had been rehearsed in front of the mirror. Chuck glanced around, looked back at Clara, and suddenly smiled. "Is that true? You're not lying." Clara pursed her lips in offense and sobbed again. Chuck chuckled and hugged her around the waist. Then, he looked her up and down, pausing at the stomach, unable to find that his child, his son, might be there. When Delilah talked incessantly about the baby, it irritated him. But now, learning that Clara was pregnant, he felt such joy that it startled him. Could it really be so important to him? "So, Chuck, what are we going to do?" "What do you mean? What are we going to do?" "Live. Our son will be born. I'll name him Richard." "But, you see, what about us?" Clara asked. "What about us?" Chuck replied. "Well, what about us? We need the child to be born within a marriage." Chuck looked at Clara. He hadn't considered that he'd have to arrange this moment somehow. Clara interpreted his silence in her own way. "Are you going back to your Delilah? She won't give you a child. She's barren. And here, Chuck, you already have your son." She patted her stomach. "But if you don't want him, then—" "Hush, hush," Chuck whispered, glancing around. "Why are you shouting? What else am I supposed to do?" Clara said. "I can't raise him alone." "Why alone? I'll help. I won't abandon you," Chuck said. "Oh, won't you? You'll help. Well, thank you." Clara got angry. Chuck rushed to her to calm her down. What is going on? He lived peacefully before, and now, at home, it's like an icy dessert. And here, a circus performance. "Clara, you misunderstood everything." "So, Chuck, either you get divorced and marry me so that the child is born legitimately, or there won't be any child. I don't want to be a single mother. Think it over carefully." Clara turned around, lifted her chin, and headed towards the exit. Chuck remained at the table. The whole evening, he pondered what to do now. He didn't like that Clara had started to blackmail him. On the other hand, it was still his child. What if it's not mine? And do I really need these diapers, nightly cries, and sleepless nights? All night long, he thought about how to arrange everything so that he wouldn't have to change much in his life. But he couldn't come up with anything. Delilah noticed that something was bothering her husband, but she had little strength to think about him. She needed to figure herself out. It was time to decide whether to try to start over or file for divorce. It was embarrassing. She would have to quit her job, She couldn't bear to see Chuck every day. Just leave him, Nina advised. You might get sick from all the stress. But where will I go? Delilah asked. My aunt has a spare room. She's been complaining that it's getting hard for her to clean, and going to the store is difficult. She broke her leg in winter and is now afraid. I go to her once a week, bring semi-finished products, clean up. You'll have your own corner there. Oh, Nina, thank you, but no, I don't want to impose on your aunt. Maybe our personalities won't match. What are you talking about? Nina waved her hands. Aunt Daphne is a wonderful person. She worked as a librarian her whole life. An intelligent woman. She reads books in French. She'll be happier with you. She even said it would be nice to find a companion like in the 19th century. Being alone is difficult and boring. You can stay with her. She'll be delighted. And then you and Chuck can sell the apartment, and you can rent your own place. Oh, no, I won't sell the apartment. Chuck put it in order with an additional payment, Delilah said. Yeah, Nina nodded. Chuck arranged it. And where did he get the additional payment? From your inheritance. Those are your money, Delilah, yours. And you have every right to the apartment. So start thinking about yourself. Understood? Delilah nodded. Just to close this topic, she went to her once beloved home, where she used to create comfort and dream about the future. There was nothing left now, just ruins. She lived another week with Chuck, watched him, and thought maybe she could forgive him. She recalled the good moments, persuaded herself to try. Perhaps the child would still be born. She almost convinced herself. Pushed away all of Nina's advice. She bought a new lace combination. She decided to be wiser and save the family. Perhaps there are many Claras, but a wife is still one. She buried all doubts and resentments deeper. She sprinkled them with a thick layer of indifference and began to build on the ruins. Today, Delilah said to herself, leaving work, I'll come home, prepare dinner, and try to forget everything. On the way, she remembered that she needed to buy bread. Lost in thought about the upcoming evening, she crossed the road, turned towards the bakery, trying not to look towards the museum where the wicked Clara worked. Suddenly, she froze. Right in front of her, by the non-working fountain, she saw her husband. Clara stood next to him, holding a bouquet of white chrysanthemums, just like the ones Chuck had recently tried to ask forgiveness from her. Passers-by hurried past. They bumped into Delilah, pushing her shoulder, but she couldn't move. With a whitened face, she watched as Chuck took Clara's hand, brought it to his lips, and kissed it. She laughed, flashing white teeth and shaking her curls. Chuck reached out and whispered something in her ear, and Clara coyly nodded her head, taking his arm. Hiding under an umbrella, they walked down the street. Someone rudely pushed Delilah again, and even swore. It was as if she woke up. She wiped away the tears, which immediately mixed with the rain, and walked towards home. She walked faster and faster, almost running, and passers-by looked at her with surprise. At home, Delilah grabbed a suitcase and began throwing in the most essential things. In a hurry and afraid that Chuck might return, and then she wouldn't be able to leave. She didn't want to hear his justifications, especially the lies. No, she could never live with a person who constantly lied. It was torture. Even a harmless delay from work would cause panic and suspicion. He would never part with Clara. Never. She was too young and beautiful. Delilah picked up her suitcase, slung a bag over her shoulder, and glanced around the apartment. So much effort had been invested. But then came the fatal beauty that ruined everything. The front door slammed shut. The key turned in the lock. A draft stood a sheet of paper on the table where Delilah had written Chuck that she would file for divorce herself. What have you come up with? Chuck said, cornering Delilah at work. You're disgracing me. I'm crawling on my knees in front of you, and here's what you're doing. Delilah calmly freed her elbow from her clinging husband, surveyed him from head to toe, and silently walked away. "Stop!" Chuck shouted. Chuck hurried after her. Delilah turned onto the next street, but Chuck didn't lag behind. "Delilah, don't play with fire. I can do things too." "What? What can you do?" Delilah turned to him. "You already did plenty. Don't embarrass yourself, Chuck. Don't come near me anymore, or everyone will quickly find out about your escapades. You won't be able to. You'll burn with shame," Chuck said angrily. Delilah looked surprised. "More shame? Live with your beauty since you're in love," Delilah said. Chuck turned white with anger. What right did she have to give him permission on who to live with? Especially when she was the one who left him first. "Yeah, love," he said. "Love. And Clara and I will have a child. My child. Do you understand? And you are barren." Delilah swayed. It felt like a train had hit her with all its might. She paled, bit her lip, looked with lifeless eyes, afraid to breathe, so as not to cringe from the pain, turned away, and walked down the street. Chuck watched her go, grimaced, and went to Clara to tell her that he had kicked his wife out of the house, and they would soon be divorced. Let her look on with admiration and rejoice. He was glad he wouldn't have to decide anything himself. Well, Delilah left on her own, just that no one needed to know. Let everyone think he abandoned her. So what? How is that? Clara asked in amazement. Did you just kick her out like that? Well, not exactly kicked out. Chuck avoided eye contact. I told her that our love is with you, that you're expecting a child. I said I'm thinking of getting a divorce, and we can't live together. Where did she go? Clara asked. Deep down, she felt sorry for Delilah. Naive and a bit foolish. Things never went well for her. I don't know. Chuck shrugged. He was still angry, but deep down, he was more upset with himself. It was unpleasant for him to recall the cruel words he had said to Delilah. He had struck her where it hurt the most. Now he felt like a scoundrel, someone who had bullied the vulnerable. That's why he tried to push these thoughts away. So, move in with me, he said. Clara lived in a small apartment with noisy and scandalous neighbors. She had wanted to leave that place for a long time. And here came Chuck, inviting her to live with him. However, she found out that she couldn't have a child. The false alarm had turned out just that, false. But Chuck didn't need to know about it. Delilah moved in with Nina's aunt, Daphne. She didn't tell Nina anything about what she had seen with Chuck and Clara, or about his words. She simply informed Nina that she had decided to leave. Living with him was something she couldn't bear. She remained silent, not wanting to relive the nightmare. Daphne turned out to be the complete opposite of her niece. Tall and slender, she gathered her gray hair into an elegant bun, always colored her lips, and even at home, wore white blouses with lace colors. Every morning, Daphne stood by the back of a chair, holding onto it and gracefully performed several ballet movements, always poised, meticulous, and neat. She was an example for Delilah, who couldn't gather herself after her collapsed family happiness. Daphne immediately understood that Delilah, like a bird with a broken wing, felt the pain inflicted on her and, therefore, didn't intrude into her soul. She only treated Delilah with thyme tea and honey, and in the evenings, read French novels aloud. Delilah rested her soul, healed. It seemed to her that she had returned to her mother's cozy home, where peace and tranquility reigned. The wounded soul whimpered but increasingly quieted down, lulled by Daphne's gentle voice. Delilah quit her job at the factory. She was tired of fearing encounters with her husband, and she no longer liked the sympathetic looks from women. She began working in the archive at a research institute. It was a calm job, with a pleasant team, and most importantly, nobody knew anything about her. One day, she came to work and found 3 white carnations on her desk. She looked around and surprised no one. "Hello, Delilah," a voice echoed from the door. She turned around, and there was Michael, a junior researcher, thin, with a prominent nose and nearsighted eyes. He always took off his glasses when coming to the archive, so he constantly squinted and bumped into shelves. "I ordered a document yesterday." Blushing, Michael said. Delilah smiled. She noticed that he often came here. Perhaps the flowers were also from him. "Yes, Michael, everything is ready." Delilah smiled and pulled out the necessary paper from the folder. Michael reached out and lightly touched Delilah's fingers. She gave him a stern look and turned to the shelves. She couldn't let this young man think that she was ready to get involved with him. After all, she was 7 years older than him. "Goodbye, Michael," Delilah said. She touched the flowers with her hand. She didn't like carnations. They reminded her of the cemetery, of her mother. Clara happily packed her things. She was so eager to move in with Chuck that she only packed the essentials and rushed out of the building. Chuck immediately picked up her suitcase and loaded it into the taxi's trunk. He wanted to show off in front of Clara. He couldn't calm down. He was proud that Delilah had made the decision herself. He flaunted himself as a decisive man. Clara smiled, pressed close to Chuck. He felt embarrassed and glanced at the old taxi driver who was throwing curious glances their way. All night, Clara thought about how to arrange everything better. She decided to give Chuck a full-fledged honeymoon. Everything would work out just fine. Later, she would simply say that the baby was born a little earlier than expected. Men don't bother with such details, and Chuck wouldn't investigate. Entering the apartment, Clara grimaced unhappily. She would have to rearrange everything here. Tastelessness in abundance. But the first thing she needed to do was change the curtains and bedspreads in the bedroom. Meanwhile, the top priority was not to let Chuck out of bed. Soon an unpleasant surprise emerged. Chuck didn't respond so eagerly to her lacy lingerie. As soon as Clara became available every day, Chuck seemed to lose interest. Clara tried everything, buying wine, preparing romantic dinners, meeting him naked out of the bath, but he hardly reacted. He sat reading the newspaper or watching TV. Clara started to get nervous. What if it turns out there is no pregnancy, and Chuck sends her back? What then? She invited by her friend from work to her birthday. At first, Clara didn't want to go, but Kerry promised an interesting and fun company. "You'll cheer up at least. You've been so gloomy lately," Kerry said. "But how can you be cheerful?" Chuck doesn't mention divorce, falls asleep in bed, and even came up with an excuse that he didn't want to harm the baby. They did have it a couple of times, of course, but Clara wasn't entirely sure that it worked out, and she couldn't drag it on much longer. The birthday turned out to be really fun. Several tour guides came. Paul the methodologist, Kerry's boyfriend, and two of his friends. One was a brunette, the other a redhead. Both were courting her, and Clara smiled sweetly, dancing with them one by one. Envious colleagues looked at her again. Again, all male attention was focused on Clara. And was it her fault? Well, she's beautiful. That's it. Champagne flowed like a river. Dissatisfied colleagues had left long ago, leaving only Kerry with her boyfriend, Tim, and Miles. Clara laughed, danced, asked again to pour some more into her glass. Some kind of joy attacked her, and she forgot that she had to go home somehow. It's still impossible to get used to the fact that a decent apartment and an almost husband are waiting for her there. She shook in the dance and again demanded cold champagne, and then lights, faces, bottles, furniture spun around. Clara fell into a thick fog. She woke up in the early morning feeling cold. The window was slightly open, and the sunrise was visible outside. Clara groaned. A terrible headache pierced her head, and her mouth felt dry and unpleasant. She had drunk so much last night. And then, in horror, she widened her eyes. She was lying on the bed, and on both sides of her, Tim and Miles were snoring, black-haired on one side and a red head on the other. Clara pulled the covers to cover her chest. God, what happened here? She doesn't remember anything. Well, she danced, laughed, climbed onto the table for some reason. And then what? How did she end up here with two at once? And what happened between them? What a nightmare. Clara cautiously got up and started dressing quickly. She barely found her crumpled dress in a pile of men's things. She also had to look for her underwear. Despite the pain in her head, only one thought pounded in her mind. What about Chuck? She didn't come home to spend the night. Everything was ruined. Now he would kick her out onto the street. My God, what a fool she was. But why did she have to drink so much? She knows how badly alcohol affects her. She went from the room to the kitchen, then peeked into Kerry's small bedroom. Kerry was sleeping, wrapped in a blanket, and her boyfriend Kurt was lying next to her. Clara gently shook Kerry by the shoulder, managed to wake her up somehow, and called her to the kitchen. While Kerry was getting dressed, Clara began to enjoy drinking cold water straight from the tap. Then she put her wet palms to her cheeks and forehead. She remembered Chuck again. She was nauseous with horror. She ruined everything herself. Don't worry, Kerry said. You'll say it got bad, and you had to stay. Or better yet, lie that you had to call an ambulance. But then it turned out there was nothing serious, and everything passed only towards morning. Understand? Clara nodded. The picture with Tim and Miles sleeping nearby did not disappear from her mind. Kerry, how did I end up with them? She asked. Kerry laughed. It just happened. They were drunk too. And did I do anything with them? Blushing, Clara asked. Oh, that's for you to know better, Kerry replied. I wasn't standing nearby. Kurt and I also went to bed. Oh, you had quite the fun. Quickly washing up, Clara went outside. She was terribly afraid that Tim and Miles would wake up, and she would have to somehow look them in the eye. No, better to go home sooner. She felt very nauseous. She quietly opened the door, quickly hung up her coat, and went to the bathroom. She urgently needed to pull herself together. Otherwise, Chuck wouldn't believe she had been at Kerry's. After 15 minutes, she looked at herself in the mirror. A little pale, but even better, bruises under her eyes. Clara brushed her teeth carefully, and only then quietly came out. Chuck was sleeping on the sofa in the living room. He hadn't even undressed. Chuck, Clara called softly. Her eyes were sad and shimmered with excitement. Chuck woke up, saw Kerry, and rubbed his face with his palm. Where were you? He asked. His gaze was stern. Clara put on a pitiful look. I had to stay at Kerry's. She had a salad there, probably not fresh, so I got poisoned. Couldn't leave the bathroom. Maybe it's also morning sickness. Clara sighed, grimaced, and I still feel nauseous. I wanted to go home, but it just didn't work out. I knew you'd worry. Stayed up all night. You weren't sick like this before, Chuck said suspiciously. Well, it doesn't start right away, Chuck. The time has come. I'll lie down. I feel bad. Trying not to harm the baby. And please make me some tea. Okay, dear. And somehow it came out so naturally, so touching that Chuck's heart trembled. He didn't have any suspicions. How could you suspect a pregnant woman? Oh, Clara, Kerry said a month later when she found out that her friend was definitely expecting a baby. What about? Nothing, Clara replied. It's Chuck's baby. And that's it. She believed it herself. She tried to erase everything that preceded the pregnancy from her memory. There was nothing. A dream, an illusion. There was only Chuck, and she was already a month along. True, only the doctor knew about it. And Chuck would be happy about the 8-month-old son or daughter. Just need to get married before the belly becomes noticeable. She was lucky so far, in everything. Clara went to the tailor, sewing her wedding dress. Chuck looked amazed as his quite decent salary disappeared. Savings were now being tapped into. He wasn't used to such extravagance. Delilah was very economical and didn't waste money. Chuck tried to talk to Clara about it, but she would cry right away, and such sadness would appear on her face that Chuck instantly felt like a miser. He decided that she would calm down after the wedding. The only condition he set was no guests and no restaurant. They would go alone, quietly get married, and buy the cake for home. Clara wanted to protest, but she realized in time that it's better not to anger Chuck, or she might lose everything. Okay, she'll survive without a celebration. The main thing is that everything else unfolds like a fairy tale. Having received the divorce certificate, Delilah felt strange. Now she was entirely defective. No husband, no children, nothing. Just dusty files in the archive and evenings with French novels. Time would pass, and she would turn into an aging lonely woman, and later into a pensioner, getting herself a cat. Sometimes she reproached herself for selling her mom's house at Chuck's insistence. Now she would go there and live quietly. She remembered Eric, whom she met on the train. Found a piece of paper with his number. Her hand reached for the phone. She wanted to talk to someone. Felt very lonely. But she restrained herself. No need. Why bother people? He has his own life, his own problems. And he probably won't remember the strange girl he had tea with. Christmas arrived. Delilah celebrated the holiday at Nina's place. It was very cozy. Aunt Daphne also came. Delilah helped with the preparations. They baked a pie together and placed gifts under the Christmas tree. Make a wish. Let's make a wish, said Nina. Delilah, did you make a wish? Delilah laughed, shook her head. What wishes could she have? She had been making the same wish for many years. And what? It didn't come true, did it? And now she didn't want anything. The days stretched monotonously, one after another. Delilah seemed not to live but to be in a half-dream. Delilah, maybe you should have a child for yourself. Huh? Nina would ask. Delilah smiled sadly. From whom? Nina. And I don't want it that way. I know what it's like to grow up without a father. It's selfish to have a child for yourself. After Christmas, Aunt Daphne planned to visit one of her friends. Nina and Delilah tried to persuade her to wait until spring, but Daphne insisted. She's very ill, and she feared she wouldn't live until spring. They saw her off. A few days later, Nina's entire family got the flu. Delilah took care of them, went to the pharmacy, and later, she fell ill herself. And Haig became scary. Completely alone. No one to buy medicine. Her head hurt from the temperature. She suffered from coughing. Delilah, swaying from weakness, made herself tea with lemon. The doctor's prescription lay on the table, and Delilah realized that folk remedies wouldn't help her. She needed medicine. The thought of calling Chuck even crossed her mind, but she recoiled in disgust, thinking, I won't ask him for help under any circumstances. And then it dawned on her. Probably, if she hadn't had a fever, she would never have called for anything. She found a piece of paper in her purse, stared at the numbers, and not wanting to change her mind, quickly dialed the number. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings, no answer. Well, fine. That meant she shouldn't have called. Delilah was about to hang up when a voice responded. Hello. Speak. Hello. Is this Eric? Delilah asked. Parker. She clarified. It's me. Why are you calling? Delilah was flustered. She fell silent, not understanding how to explain who she was. I'm sorry. Delilah was about to hang up. Wait. Your voice sounds familiar, he said. I know you. Wait a minute. Delilah. Is it you, Eric? It's Delilah. She finally said, remember, we were on the train together. I was at the resort, and you were on a business trip. Delilah. Oh, I never hoped. I thought I'd never hear from you again. How glad I am that you called. But your voice sounds a bit sick. Are you okay? Eric asked with concern. No, she suddenly said. Not okay at all. I'm very sick, and there's no one around. I need to buy medicine at the pharmacy. She suddenly felt very sorry for herself and wiped away tears. Tell me the address, the man replied. Where should I come? Maybe I can buy something on the way. What pills do you need? Oh, there are prescriptions. "A list the doctor gave me," Delilah whispered. She was afraid to believe what she heard. Could someone drop everything and come just for her? Help her? It was so amazing. She really got sick. But when it happened, Chuck never took care of her. On the contrary, he was dissatisfied if she didn't find the strength to cook dinner. Usually, Nina brought the medicine, and Chuck watched TV, read the newspaper, and generally believed that Delilah was pretending. But if he got sick, Delilah had to spend all her free time next to him. She brought him medicine by the hour, handed him the thermometer, and applied compresses to his forehead. Even though the temperature was not high, Chuck's illness turned into worship for him. And now, for the first time, a man was ready to drop everything and come for her. Can it really happen? Delilah gave the address, and Eric promised to be there within an hour. Delilah looked at herself in the mirror. Horror. Red, teary eyes, skin peeling under her nose. Her voice was hoarse, and she coughed every minute. Nightmare. On the other hand, it's not like she invited him for a date. He'll help, bring medicine, and that's it. She won't see him again. Delilah returned to her room and crawled under the blanket to rest for a while. She dozed off. She woke up to the sound of the doorbell. On her way, she grabbed the prescription for the medicine from the kitchen. She opened the door slightly. Eric stood before her, entering the hallway. In his hand, he had a cloth bag with something inside. "Where's your kitchen, Delilah?" Eric asked, heading down the corridor. She was bewildered, not understanding why he entered her apartment. She followed him to the kitchen. Eric had already placed a jar of cranberry jam, a lemon, and several oranges on the table. Vitamins. He smiled, taking a closer look at Delilah. He frowned and suddenly put his hand on her forehead. "Goodness," he exclaimed. "Quick, to bed." "Where's the prescription?" Delilah handed him the piece of paper. Eric tucked the prescription into his pocket. "Lie down," he advised. "I'll be quick." Delilah smiled, sniffled, and, suppressing a cough, went back to her room. She felt Eric's gaze on her back. She collapsed into bed without strength, not caring what this man might think of her. The kitchen clinked with dishes, and the kettle hissed. After 5 minutes, Eric appeared in the room. In his hand, he held a mug with cranberry and lemon tea. "It'll cool down a bit, and be sure to drink it, Delilah. It's very beneficial. Promise." Delilah nodded and turned away. She didn't want Eric to notice her tears. She wanted to hide under the covers with her head. Eric disappeared. The front door slammed shut. Delilah reached for the mug, took a sip, and drank it all. She leaned back on the pillow, feeling warm. 20 minutes later, Eric returned. In his hand, he had a paper bag with medicines. He brought a glass of water and gave her a few tablets. "Have you eaten anything?" he asked. Delilah shook her head. "Don't feel like it, really." "Okay, the body knows best. It needs to conserve energy for now. So drink more. The fever will subside, and you'll feel better." He seemed to be justifying himself. Delilah felt awkward. She was distracting a person, and he had a son at home. "Eric, you should go." "Thank you. You've helped me a lot." "Thank you. Oh, and there's money in the wallet." Eric grimaced and waved his hand, and Delilah couldn't argue. "Do you mind if I come by again tomorrow?" Eric suddenly asked. "Why?" Delilah got scared. Eric shrugged, unable to find an answer. "I'll drop by in the evening." "Okay, I'll bring you something to eat. Hopefully, you'll feel better tomorrow. Just focus on getting well, all right?" he sternly admonished. Delilah smiled. Was she dreaming? She was grateful to Eric for not asking why she was alone, where her husband and family were, how she ended up in this situation with no one else to turn to. After taking all the medications, she felt the pain leaving her body, her head clearing, and breathing becoming easier. Delilah fell into a deep sleep, as if sinking into a pit. Meanwhile, in the semi-empty bus, a man sat, smiling, feeling the gaze of the woman he had often remembered since his trip. His son welcomed him. "Where have you been? I've reheated dinner twice already. Isaac, went to help someone. A good person." He sat down to eat, glancing at his son. He's growing, changing, becoming more like Brianna. Serious, enjoys chess, mathematics, and reads a lot, just like Brianna. It's been 5 years since he and his son have been living alone. Brianna left very quickly. The illness took her in just 2 months. No one expected that a young, flourishing woman would weaken so rapidly that she couldn't lift her head from the pillow. "Take care of Isaac, Eric," she whispered in her final days. A month after the funeral, a neighbor started coming to him. But Eric quickly made it clear that he had no intention of having any romances. "I need to raise our son. No time for foolishness." At work, single girls flirted with the not-so-old widower. But Eric didn't care. And now, only recently, a modest gray-eyed woman with hair like a mermaid's had caught his heart. And today, miraculously, he met her again. If only something could work out between them. Although it's scary, who would want to connect with a teenager? And Isaac's reaction is unknown. His heart tightened with sorrow. He tossed and turned at night, unable to sleep. Getting up, pouring himself water, listening, making sure he didn't wake his son, and eagerly awaiting the next day, or more precisely, the evening. All day, Delilah wondered if Eric would come. The temperature still lingered, but weakness decreased, and Delilah managed to reach the bathroom, wash up, and fix her hair. She changed clothes and tidied up the room a bit. Weakness trembled her hands immediately. Delilah lay down, pulled a blanket over herself, and drifted into a nap. She dreamt of walking along an endless sandy beach with the sun shining brightly on her face. In the distance, the outlines of mountains were visible, and waves rolled onto her bare feet. The hem of her long dress got wet and stuck to her legs, but Delilah marched forward because there, in the distance, she saw a bright silhouette. It pulled her like a magnet. She kept working and walking, but the silhouette didn't approach. And then Delilah ran and suddenly fell. In the distance, a steamship hummed again and again. Delilah startled and opened her eyes. Someone was ringing the doorbell. Delilah jumped up, got tangled in the blanket, and almost fell. Her soul sang with joy. He came. He didn't deceive. She went to open the door. "Well, finally," Eric sighed. "I've been calling and calling. Got worried. Thought maybe they took you to the hospital." "I fell asleep," Delilah said. She let Eric in. In his hand, he held another bag. The man undressed, went to the bathroom, rinsed his hands, and then went to the kitchen. Delilah followed him. "You're feeling better today," Eric noted, and took a chicken out of the bag. "I brought a chicken," Eric said, and started preparing the pot. Delilah looked at the man in amazement, as if she saw an alien. Can people be so domesticated? Oh yes, she remembered. His wife died. Still, she was surprised. Chuck, in their entire married life, went to the store twice, and that was when she was in the hospital. "You need broth," Eric said. Delilah just nodded. It was unusual, of course. She felt that both of them were embarrassed, like school kids, and clearly liked each other. "Why am I making up things?" she asked herself. "What sympathies can there be? It's just a friendly gesture." She turned away, realizing it wasn't just friendly. Look at the warmth between them. To hide the awkwardness, she quickly took out the pot, and they started making broth. Eric sat Delilah down, and he began preparing a drink for her. "Did you take your medicine?" he asked. Delilah nodded. "I'm already feeling better, Eric." Delilah scrutinized his face attentively. Eric's gaze remained steady and open. All right, she would give it a try. But it felt so unusual. Eric took charge of the kitchen as if he had always lived there. Delilah felt a bit awkward. This is how she welcomed a guest. The hostess sitting with folded hands while he did everything. "Well, while the broth is cooking. I think you should lie down, Eric said, taking a cup with a drink and heading to the room. Delilah followed him, amazed. Throughout the next day, she remembered how Eric, sitting on a chair by her bed, shared stories about his birthplace and their family travels across the country when his father was in the military. Later, he brought her a deep bowl of golden broth. And for yourself? Delilah asked. You need to eat too, right? Oh, I'll eat at home, Eric said. He left, and Delilah pondered for a long time about his kind eyes and the care he enveloped her with in just 2 days. She understood that from his perspective, it was simply helping a lonely sick person, purely friendly. Nevertheless, she dreamed that he would invite her, perhaps to the movies. But Eric never visited her again. He only called once more, inquired about her health, and that was it. Delilah was angry with herself, imagining that someone else needed her, and men only desired women like Clara. Delilah returned to work. During her illness, so many tasks had piled up that there was no time to think about silly things. A week later, Delilah stopped by the toy store in the evening to buy a birthday gift for Simona, Nina's daughter. While examining curly dolls, she saw Eric. He stood by the board game shelf, studying the boxes attentively. Delilah almost jumped. Her heart pounded with joy. She was about to approach him when a young, brown-haired woman appeared next to Eric, smiled, and took him by the arm. Delilah stepped back and hid behind the shelves. Tears welled up in her eyes. Silly me, getting carried away. Chuck was right. No one will look at her. Helped a person once, and she already envisioned a wedding with him. Unable to buy a gift, she left the store, boarded the bus, and stared sadly out the window. The woman beside Eric looked so content, quite young, and he smiled at her with tenderness. Probably, he had many women like her. He's a free man, can afford it. Eric called her the next day. Delilah, hello, sorry, got caught up. Didn't have time to stop by. How are you? Feeling better? Delilah winced at his faint concern. I'm fine, Eric, she replied. Excuse me. I don't have time to talk right now. I understand. Eric's voice sounded puzzled. I'll call you later then. No. Delilah almost shouted. Don't call he anymore. Delilah, I don't understand. What happened? I just wanted to say that. But Delilah hung up. The phone rang immediately again. She lowered the volume. She wouldn't talk to this man. It was pointless. She had enough of deception. In the mirror, her sad face flashed. She'd rather be alone all her life than believe, only to be burned and suffer. Chuck walked to work feeling gloomy. Again in the morning, Clara was whining and crying. This time she was upset because he ate an apple, and she wanted it for breakfast. Imagine, an apple. He always ate the fruits Delilah brought, and she never said a word, just smiled. Eat, Chuck. I've got myself into a mess. Chuck thought irritably as he headed to the bus stop. It was slippery, light rain was falling, and all the clothes felt damp. The mood was completely ruined. The bus was delayed again. Chuck pulled his hat down and pondered. The initial euphoria of living with Clara had faded. Clara spent more time lying on the couch reading magazines, sleeping, watching TV. The room was always filled with plates, leftovers, apples, crumbs, and unfinished tea. Chuck came home tired and hungry. But Clara lazily waved her hand towards the fridge. There's something in the freezer. Heat it up. Chuck got angry, grumbled, and then Clara rounded her doll-like blue eyes and trembled her lips pitifully. Don't you understand that it's harmful for me to worry in my condition? I feel bad. Can't stand by the stove. She hardly visited the museum. She constantly took sick leaves, and Chuck had to spend almost his entire salary. It was unusual for him. Delilah used to handle all household expenses, and he could save money. Every day she reminded him that it was time to get married. He promised, but still procrastinated, as if it could change something. Finally, A date was set. They quickly married. On the way back, she was offended and dissatisfied. I wanted a celebration, a white dress. And you, everything is ordinary. As if I didn't get married, but just took a stroll to the bank. Sometimes the thought troubled her. Who is she really pregnant by? Once she was walking down the street with Chuck, and suddenly she saw Miles coming out of the store. His red hair gleamed in the sunlight. She stopped, turned away, and immediately pulled Chuck to the bus stop. Oh, feeling a bit dizzy. Let's sit on the bench. Miles didn't notice her. He ran past. Maybe he wouldn't even recognize me. Clara thought sadly, glancing cautiously in his direction. It seemed like everything was going well. She had a husband, an apartment, and a baby on the way, but there was an emptiness in her heart. It turned out that occasional meetings with Chuck were not the same as living together. All the romance and novelty of feelings had disappeared. Chuck would throw his things wherever, especially his socks. I'm allergic to detergent. And besides, it's harmful to the baby. She replied to Chuck's requests to wash his shirt. Now on Saturdays, instead of going to the bar with friends, Chuck arranged the laundry. Clothes got mixed up and faded, looking like old worn-out rags. We should take them to the laundromat, Clara advised. They'll wash them well there. Chuck couldn't imagine what the house would turn into when the baby arrived. His entire life now was a series of whims, tears, and ultimatums. He became nervous. He sadly remembered how he used to come home and even complained if Delilah didn't manage to put dinner on the table in time. He got angry at himself for these thoughts and tried to push them away. He couldn't admit that life with Delilah was better. So, he forced himself to believe that Clara would change over time, learn everything, and this was just a phase. But deep down, he knew Clara would never become a good homemaker. Okay, Chuck consoled himself. At least, she'll give birth to my son. But even this argument didn't inspire him. If given the choice to relive life with Delilah without children, or with Clara but with a child, he would probably choose the former. For Delilah, he was like a child himself. But with Clara, what if, when the son is born, she distances herself completely and puts Chuck in the background? And Clara gazed at her rounding belly, consoling herself with the thought that all babies are born the same, and Chuck isn't too attentive. Even if the child isn't his, he'll never notice. Besides, Clara didn't mind the plan to take the child away from the mother after a year. Let her grow up there, in the fresh air, while she stays here with Chuck. No more children. She'll take care of that. So, these two lived, thinking that everything would somehow work out in the future. While the present rushed by day after day, Eric stared thoughtfully out of the window as snow fell all day. Eric, will you take this suit with you? Tina stood in the doorway holding a hanger with a brown suit. Her gray eyes looked concerned. No, Tina. Why? One suit is enough for meetings. And the rest of the time, I'm in work clothes. You know, the factory. All right. In general, I've packed everything. Tina turned to leave, but caught Eric's melancholy look. She stopped. Eric, something's wrong with you. You're not yourself. Or are you worried about Isaac? You don't think he won't listen to his dear aunt, do you? Tina put her hands on her hips and playfully frowned. Eric laughed. Well, the nephew is almost your height already, and you're only a few years older. Tina smiled and approached Eric, took him by the hand, and rested her head on his shoulder. Eric, go on your trip with peace of mind. We'll manage. I have no doubt. Tina, Eric said quietly, and kissed her on the forehead. Tina stood for another minute and went to the kitchen. The scent of baking filled the air. Eric turned back to the window. He couldn't forget Delilah's icy voice on the phone, her indifference, and the demand not to call again. Was it all in his head? Did he imagine that she was indifferent to him? That she was embarrassed, happy to see him, and to accept his help? Did he fantasize at all? For the first time in 5 years, he felt such warmth, closeness, and, alas, he was wrong. It's frustrating. It hurts. Eric, go have some tea. Tina's voice came. Eric emerged from his dark thoughts. Tina, the younger sister born to parents over 40. He and his middle brother had taken care of her, protected her, cherished and loved her. Unfortunately, Peter, the brother, died in a motorcycle accident. If only he were still around, he'd swoop Tina up, twirl her in the air, and her laughter would resonate all around. Those were happy times. How Tina supported him when Brianna died. She didn't cry, even though she loved Brianna very much. She did her best to comfort Eric and Isaac. And now, when it turned out that he needed to go on a business trip for 2 months, Tina immediately came to stay with Isaac during this time. She could have declined. She's so beautiful, and many are interested in her, always inviting her to movies or the theater. However, she decided to transform into a family caretaker for 2 months, ensuring her nephew was looked after, well-fed, and had his lessons checked. Eric scratched his forehead. He spoke to Isaac like a man, seriously and without jokes. He instructed him not to be foolish and to take care of his young aunt Tina, not making her nervous over trivial matters. "I'm counting on you, Isaac," he said, looking into his son's eyes. "Well, Dad," Isaac stammered, "when have I ever let you down?" Yet, his heart was still uneasy. It was all because he couldn't tell Delilah where he was going, for how long, and why he wouldn't be able to visit anymore. He didn't expect that she wouldn't listen. Did she plan to return to her husband? Or perhaps Eric wasn't to her liking? It was all so confusing. Nevertheless, he would try calling again in a week. Perhaps Delilah could explain everything. Then he'd know for sure whether he had a chance to catch the attention of this beautiful woman with the kind gray eyes. The next day, the train carried him to the city where he would spend 2 months in solitude. It would be nice if he could write a letter to Delilah from there, and she could respond. It would make time pass more quickly, and his heart would feel warmer. Delilah tried to live a normal life. Sometimes the thought crossed her mind to move far away to another city so that nobody would know who she was and what had happened in her life. So that the streets and houses wouldn't remind her of her youth and dates with Chuck. So that she wouldn't fear running into Clara with her big round belly. But it was scary. How was she all alone there? And how could she not see Nina? Not visit her warm home? It was all so difficult. She thought again about Eric. Maybe she shouldn't have avoided talking to him. On the other hand, would she listen? Chuck said a lot, apologized, brought flowers. But in reality, he continued running to Clara. Tears welled up in her eyes. One evening, closing the archive door, she bumped into Michael in the hallway. He stood in front of her, with a faint hope in his eyes. "Delilah, good evening. I know you've been avoiding me, but still, maybe you'll agree to go to the theater on Saturday. The play is very interesting, and you've probably heard that there are famous actors. I managed to get 2 tickets." Michael indeed held 2 tickets in his hand. Delilah was taken aback. She had explained everything to him, or so she thought. But Michael looked at her so politely and hopefully that she couldn't find the courage to refuse. "Well, okay, Michael." Delilah smiled. "Let's go." Michael, not expecting such an answer, blushed with embarrassment. "Oh, thank you, Delilah. I'm so glad you agreed. Shall we meet at the theater at 6? Delilah nodded and, saying goodbye, headed towards the exit, while Michael remained standing in the corridor, watching her leave. Delilah briskly walked down the street, unable to understand why she agreed to meet Michael. "Just want to see an interesting play," she told herself. "It's not a date. If it were a date, and if Michael weren't younger than me, maybe I would have married him." Married? She chuckled. She crossed the road, went to the store, intending to buy cookies. She bought a whole bag of sweets and stepped outside. And suddenly, right in front of her, walking hand in hand with Clara, there was Chuck. It was impossible to hide or run away anymore. Delilah bravely looked her ex-husband in the face, but Clara tried to ignore her. Chuck cleared his throat and averted his eyes, while Clara pressed closer to his elbow. "Hello, Delilah," Chuck greeted. "Yeah, hello," Delilah replied, and attempted to bypass the couple. "How are you?" Chuck asked. "Good," Delilah smiled. "Better than ever. Sorry, I'm in a hurry." Gripping the railing, she started descending. She didn't see that Chuck turned around and watched her go. "Can we go already?" Clara said impatiently, tugging at Chuck's sleeve. He sighed, glanced back once more, and entered the store. Delilah hurried home, where she could hide from everyone and reflect once again on what could have been if she hadn't seen Eric with the young woman in the children's store. Meanwhile, Eric was overwhelmed with tasks. They assigned him a one-bedroom apartment for the duration of the business trip, where he would spend the next 2 months. The accommodation was entirely bachelor-like, not cozy at all, but he would only come here to sleep. The factory was launching a new workshop, so there was a lot of work. Yet, every night, as he laid his head on the pillow, he found himself thinking about the woman with gray eyes and soft, thick hair. He hoped she would appear in his dreams. He still hadn't mustered the courage to call her. He was afraid. What if she told him again not to bother her? But at least there was hope. When he returned, he would buy a magnificent bouquet and go straight to her. Then, she wouldn't just hang up. She would have to talk. Eric frequently called home, inquiring about Isaac's progress, asking Tina if he was causing any mischief. But his sister always assured him that everything was fine, and she had no complaints about her nephew. Eric was happy, but he still dreamt of getting back to his son as soon as possible. Perhaps it wasn't just the sun pulling him back. That fateful day started out just like any other. Following it, there was scheduled equipment inspection, and Eric headed to the workshop. Gradually, everyone who needed to sign the documents gathered. There was no rush. There was enough time until evening, and the work was proceeding according to plan. Eric and a few other engineers stood by one of the machines. The equipment was new, and everyone was eager to see how it would perform in action. Around them, the machinery roared, and workers bustled about. Eric scanned the workshop for the workshop manager, saw him hurrying towards them, checking a stack of papers in his hands as he walked. Then, Eric decided to approach the farthest machine for a moment to make sure the workers hadn't forgotten to install the protective shield. Suddenly, he heard a piercing screech from above. He managed to lift his head and noticed how one of the iron stacks tilted. Rolling for a few seconds, the load slid even more. At that moment, a young guy emerged from behind the machine. He ran straight under the crane and stared curiously at the looming structure. Eric himself barely had time to react as he rushed towards the guy and pushed him aside. The noise of the machines drowned out the wild crash, and not only iron sheets, but also beams and metal rods came crashing down. One of these rods struck Eric in the back, a bright flash of pain, and he collapsed, plunging into darkness many kilometers away from the workshop. The woman with gray eyes felt her heart racing for some reason. She stood on the ladder, pulling out dusty folders with documents. When she sensed that something was wrong, as if something had happened, her heart pounded with fear. I need to call Nina. Or what if something's wrong with Daphne? Or something happened to Chuck? Or maybe it's just blood pressure. I had a headache in the morning, so various horrors are now haunting me. Delilah called her friend. She spoke with Nina's husband, who assured her that everything was fine. Then she called Daphne. Everything was good with everyone. What could have happened to Chuck? Now he has someone to take care of him. A melancholy thought of Eric flew by. Why? Who knows? She couldn't get this man out of her heart. Even though she had forbidden herself to think about him 100 times. She scolded herself for asking him not to call her. Eventually, she tried to just move on. The theater outing with Michael once again confirmed that relationships built on pity are impossible. He came with flowers and spent the entire play not watching the stage, but staring at Delilah. She felt uncomfortable. She tried not to turn her head. During intermission, Michael suggested having champagne, but Delilah declined. They stood in awkward silence. After the play, Michael decided to accompany Delilah home. She had to agree, but she refused a taxi. They rode in a half-empty bus, and silence enveloped them again. Despite him being a good and intelligent person who looked at her like a goddess, she didn't like him. Only thoughts were spinning. It would be nice to go to the theater with Eric, or it would be nice if Eric asked to take her hand right now. And he wouldn't ask. He would just take her frozen hand into his broad and warm palm. That's all. In the evening, her head started aching again. Delilah took a pill and just dreamt of getting home quickly and going to bed early. She would skip the traditional tea with Daphne today. She had no strength for that. Daphne didn't insist, but she still brought her a cup of tea with mint. Drink it, Delilah. You'll fall asleep faster, wrapped in a blanket. Delilah dozed off. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Muffled female voices echoed in the hallway. Delilah raised her head, and the door happened to be slightly ajar. Delilah. Daphne whispered, "Are you sleeping? Someone came to see you." "Tommy." Delilah was surprised. "Who?" Daphne shrugged. Delilah put on her slippers and walked out of the room. In the hallway stood a young woman Delilah had seen with Eric at the store. Her face was pale, and only her huge gray eyes, filled with anxiety and horror, were visible. "Tommy." "Yes," the girl said. "Are you Delilah?" Delilah nodded. She couldn't understand why Eric's girl had come here and what she needed. "Delilah, I don't know who else to turn to. Colleagues will help with something, of course, but what to do next? I don't know. Please help." "Wait," Delilah asked. "I don't understand anything. Who are you?" I'm Tina. An accident happened to Eric. He's in the hospital. Doctors are scaring us. I don't know what to do. They say he might end up paralyzed." Delilah leaned against the wall, folded her arms on her chest. "So, Tina, you don't need a disabled husband, I guess. But why did you come to me? How did you find my address?" Tina blushed. Tears sparkled in her eyes. "I found the address. It was on a piece of paper. And overall, sorry. I probably made a mistake. Sorry." Tina turned around, trying to open the lock. Her movements were nervous. Delilah felt ashamed. She lashed out at a person who had come seeking help. "Tina, forgive me, please. Let's go to the kitchen. I'll pour you some tea. You can tell me everything, or else I don't understand anything." Tina carefully examined Delilah's face, then hesitantly started unwinding her scarf. Delilah poured tea and looked at Tina. She sat with her head down. A few teardrops fell from her eyelashes, and the girl quickly wiped them away. "Do you want jam, Tina?" Delilah asked. Tina sighed and shook her head. "No, Delilah, thank you." She took a cautious sip and sighed again. Delilah sat across from her. "Eric, my older brother." "Delilah," Tina said, looking at her. "There were 3 of us. Eric, the oldest, then Peter, then me. I'm much younger, born late. And Eric and Peter, they were always together." Tina sobbed. "And then, Peter died, crashed on a motorcycle, and only Eric was left for me and my parents. If something happens to him, I don't know what we'll all do." Unable to hold back, Tina burst into tears. Delilah jumped up, rushed to her, holding her head against herself, stroking her hair, and biting her lips. "Oh, what a fool I am. How could I tell this girl about a disabled husband? I'm so stupid." Tina cried so much that Delilah's heart ached with compassion. She continued to stroke her head and patiently waited for the girl to calm down. Finally, Tina quieted down. "Oh," she said. "I'm sorry." "It's okay, Tina. It's okay. Let's go, wash up, and we'll think together about what to do now." Delilah led Tina to the bathroom. Then they sat for a long time in the kitchen. Delilah listened attentively to Tina, slightly frowning her thick eyebrows. "I would go to the hospital, but I have Isaac. I haven't told him, and I haven't told my parents. They won't handle it. Both of them have weak hearts. Dad had a heart attack 2 years ago, and it's right that you haven't told them yet. Smart move, Delilah said. We'll tell them later. It will get better. The danger will pass, and we'll tell them. Do you think he'll recover? Tina asked, raising her tearful eyes to Delilah. Of course, Delilah replied. It can't be otherwise. He's a strong man, and the doctors will get him back on his feet quickly. They sat in the kitchen for a long time. Tina calmed down, although the worry in her eyes didn't disappear. She smiled as she talked about Eric, his complicated fate, the loss of his wife whom he loved deeply, about how much he loves Isaac, how he never went on a date once in 5 years, and they all concluded that he would now remain forever alone. Before he left, we talked. Tina looked into Delilah's eyes, and he told me a bit about you. You know, when he spoke, his face lit up, like it used to when Brianna was alive. Oh, excuse me, please, it must be unpleasant for you. Tina apologized. No, not at all. Delilah smiled. On the contrary, I feel so ashamed. He called me, probably wanted to warn me that he's leaving for a long time. And Delilah lowered her eyes. And I was angry with him, stopped talking, and even asked him never to call again. Delilah didn't look at Eric's sister. She scolded herself for being afraid to talk, to figure everything out. Maybe then Eric wouldn't be so upset and would be more careful. What if that would have saved him? Soon, Tina began to get ready to leave. You must call me tomorrow without fail, Delilah requested. If you hear anything, call anytime, both here and at work. Promise me. And I will call you. Yes, of course, Delilah. Tina ran down the stairs, and Delilah stood at the open door as if hoping that Tina would return, laugh, and say that she and Eric played a trick on her. Delilah, come inside, please, Daphne said. Delilah obeyed. Locking the door, she sat on a chair in the hallway. What do we do now, Daphne? She asked, looking at the old woman. We need to go, Delilah. Go to him. Can't you see? You need each other, and he'll feel it. He'll definitely feel that you're there, and he'll find strength. Delilah asked for leave. She called Tina, found out which hospital Eric was in, picked up her suitcase, and went to the train station, just to be there in time, just to be near him. There was no doubt, no fear. She would heal him, get him back on his feet, and she wouldn't give him to anyone else. From the station, she went straight to the hotel, left her things, and went to the hospital. And who are you to him? The nurse asked. Me. Delilah was confused. I'm an acquaintance. Information is only for relatives. Next, Delilah was lost, stepped aside. Tina was left with Isaac, and no other relatives were in the know. Around her was the usual life of the hospital, where everything smelled of sickness, fear, tears, and hope. Suddenly, a round nurse came out, walking down the corridor with a dissatisfied face. She looked at Delilah indifferently. Delilah had a sudden realization. Where did the courage come from? She stepped towards the woman. Hello, can you help me? Please. Do you work here? Yeah, nodded the orderly. In the trauma unit. Delilah felt her heart leap. After all, Eric was lying exactly there. She looked around, opened her purse, and carefully took out a bill from her wallet. Awkwardly clenching it in her fist, she said, "Please help me. I need to know about the patient's condition." But they won't tell me. And who are you to him? The orderly's eyes lit up with curiosity. The fiancé. Blushing, Delilah replied, "I have a request for you." Delilah grabbed the orderly's chubby hand and rustled the bill. She smiled and took the money from Delilah's hand. No one noticed. You can find out how he is and read him this note. I don't know if he's conscious or not, but please read it anyway. The orderly squinted her eyes. All right, I'll find out. Write it. It's no trouble for me," and turned away. Delilah took out a small notebook and a pen, wrote a few lines, carefully tore it out, and handed it to the orderly. She indifferently stuffed the note into her pocket. "Wait." Delilah reminded her of Eric's full name once more and waited. She was very tired from the journey, the anxieties, and worrying about Eric. The thought flashed that maybe she came here for nothing, but it disappeared immediately. Her heart told her it was the right decision. "Woman, can you hear me?" Delilah startled and turned around. She hadn't noticed how much time had passed. The orderly returned and stood right in front of her. "I found you, Eric. He's lying there, waiting for the professors. There will be a council," she said. "He's conscious and understands everything. I read him the note. Here's his response. I wrote it down." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a piece of paper with something written on it. "Thank you." Delilah thanked quietly and stepped aside. "Feel free to ask. I'll be here tomorrow from 4 in the afternoon. My name is Petty." "And what's your name?" the orderly asked. "Delilah. I'll come tomorrow. I'll definitely come." With trembling fingers, Delilah unfolded the note. Eric expressed his joy upon seeing her and initially couldn't believe it was really her. He asked her not to worry and assured her that almost everything was fine with him, promising a speedy recovery now that he knew Delilah was by his side. There were no mentions of prognosis or detailed information about his condition, but Delilah was grateful for the assurance. She walked through the unfamiliar streets of the city, unintentionally straying far from the hospital, finding herself on the outskirts among wooden houses. Eventually, at the very edge where the road turned towards the highway, Delilah stumbled upon a small white church. She stopped, gazing at the dark cross on top. Suddenly, as if a force pushed her from behind, Delilah took a step and headed towards the stone building. It felt like someone was calling her. She pushed the wooden door, entered the dimly lit interior, finding no one inside. Delilah paused near the entrance. She didn't know any prayers. The candles flickered. She raised her head, closed her eyes, and began whispering a single request. "Let Eric get better. Let Eric get better." Tears streamed down her cheeks, and a sense of relief filled her soul. Delilah stood for a while and then exited. For 2 weeks, Delilah visited the hospital every day. Initially, she sent only notes through Petty, and later, she started sending some groceries. She received responses and carefully read every line. Then, one day, they handed her a sheet on which Eric had written a few lines. Overjoyed, she pressed the paper to her chest. It meant he was improving. It wasn't as dire as she had feared. Once, Petty managed to arrange a meeting with the treating doctor, who briefly but clearly explained the patient's condition. "We can't promise anything," he said, "but there's hope for a favorable outcome. Hope is always there. Wait, pray, believe." And Delilah believed. Tina called, delivering updates. She became close friends with Eric's sister. She even wanted to tell Isaac about her, but Delilah asked her not to. She didn't think about a future with Eric. All that mattered was the present, his recovery. The day finally came when they allowed her to visit Eric in the ward. Delilah was nervous. Petty guided her through the long corridors, pushed open a white door. Delilah glanced fearfully at it and bravely stepped inside. There were only 2 beds in the room, and she immediately saw Eric. Thin, poorly shaved, he lay on his back, and he would have to stay that way for at least 2 more weeks before attempting to work gradually. The doctors didn't offer much hope, but treatment continued. "It all depends on him," the doctor said. "The main thing is not to fall into despair. And, of course, work hard, discipline, and exercises." "Delilah, finally," Eric said with a smile. His eyes sparkled with joy. Delilah approached, sitting on a chair by the bed. "How are you, Eric?" she asked. "I'll pull through. The main thing is that you're here. Now I'll definitely get better." He took her hand, and Delilah's fingers disappeared in his warm, broad palm. "Tina and Isaac are doing well. Delilah said. Isaac only found out yesterday that you had a minor injury, and your parents don't know. That's right, Eric replied. No need to worry them. I'll recover and come to them on my own feet. Delilah looked at him sadly, hoping it would be so. Delilah, just don't leave. Okay. His voice held so much hope and tenderness. I won't leave, Eric. Just recover quickly. 3 weeks later, a man and a woman entered the train car. The man carefully moved his legs, holding onto a special support, while the woman walked beside him, ready to rush to his aid at any moment. The man swayed, and the woman rushed to support him, but he shook his head, clenched his lips, and continued walking on his own. Careful, Eric, Delilah said. Doctors allowed him to return home but advised caution, continue therapeutic exercises, and, most importantly, go to a health resort. Eric nodded, not really listening. He just wanted to leave the hospital and finally see his family. It was time to go back. Before leaving, she again ran into the small church, thanking the higher powers that helped Eric. Lucky you, not a wife, but gold, said an old woman sitting nearby. She had been watching them for a while, noticing how caring Delilah was towards Eric. Take care of her, Brianna said. I am, Eric replied, looking at Delilah. They were greeted at the station by Tina and Isaac. The tall, slender guy with gray eyes immediately embraced his father. Then Isaac looked at her, a bit embarrassed, and picked up the bag. Isaac, meet Delilah, Eric said. This is the same good person I helped in winter, and now she helped me. Delilah, anxious, waited to see the teenager's response. Isaac looked at her face attentively and with a slight smile. Delilah glanced at Eric, who winked as if to say, I told you everything would be fine. While Tina shared stories of how well Isaac was doing and how peacefully they had lived during this time, she smiled, observing her brother's gaze warming up as he looked at Delilah. It had been a while since she had seen such eyes. Only once before when Brianna was beside Eric. Isaac also noticed the change in his father. He is a smart and kind young man, and he won't impose conditions on his father. He said yesterday, I thought about it. About Delilah. I'm fine with it if they get married. Amazingly, even now, when he's not completely healthy, she feels next to him like behind a stone wall. Knowing that he loves her. No loud words or assurances are needed. A tender look, a light touch, and the feeling that there was no one in her life except Eric. Everything else faded away, leaving only this man, the most beloved. Delilah used to think it wasn't possible. It turns out it is. Almost like in books. Delilah met Eric, and now she has a son, not born to her, but still her son. Somehow, Delilah knew that they were kindred souls with Eric, and therefore, they would always be together from now on. Summer turned out to be hot with no rain. Chuck stood by the wide-open window, gazing at the sky. Today was supposed to bring rain, but there were no clouds in sight. Last night, the ambulance took Clara to the maternity hospital. It seemed a bit early to him. He thought she still had a whole month to go, but that's how it turned out. This morning, he called the hospital, and they told him his wife hadn't given birth yet. He had to wait. Chuck scratched his chin, craving a cold beer, but he couldn't. He might have to drive to Clara at any moment. He understood that most likely he wouldn't see her today. But still, he refrained from opening the fridge and grabbing a beer. He was worried, of course, though he wouldn't call his new family life happy. He had been through a lot during Clara's pregnancy, lots of whims and tantrums. He himself had been counting the days until the delivery. He glanced around the room. Mess. Everything scattered, not taken care of. Dust everywhere. He needed to tidy up, or he'd bring his son into such a mess. He had about 5 days at his disposal. Maybe ask the neighbor for help. He remembered how Delilah's apartment used to shine when she lived here. How is she doing now? Ah, if only he could turn back time. Vaguely, But suspicion had already crept into his soul that now he would have to endure not only Clara's tears and reproaches, but also the cries of the baby in dirty diapers. Chuck sighed. Strangely, even the thought of the baby didn't bring him joy. Or maybe he just hadn't gotten used to it yet. Clara keeps saying that in a year, she'll send the child to her mother. He'll be better off there. Chuck, we're not too old. We need to live for ourselves. We'll go to the seaside for a vacation. In a year, I'll get back in shape. And off we go. You know what kind of swimsuit I found? Chuck remained silent. He didn't like how Clara referred to their son, as if he were some puppy or kitten. It felt wrong somehow. Unpleasant. But he didn't say anything about it. Clara nodded. Sure, we'll do that if you agree. By evening, they received the news that Clara had given birth to a girl. Good weight, proper height, and quite vocal. Chuck was in shock. A girl. What about the son? He listened to himself. Neither joy nor excitement, as if he didn't have a child now. 4 days later, he went to the hospital for the discharge. Clara came out pale, with dark circles under her eyes. She sucked everything out of me like a vacuum, she complained, taking flowers from her husband. Cries and cries. Chuck held the bundle with a pink bow, saw a tiny nose, tightly closed eyes with long, light red eyelashes. Resembled a doll. Only at home, when Clara took off the girl's hat, he saw curly, fiery red hair. He stared at his wife in disbelief. What are you looking at? Clara said angrily. Well, she's a redhead. My grandmother had the same. That's where she gets it from. Chuck skeptically looked at his daughter, then back at Clara, but she turned away. She hoped he hadn't figured anything out from her face. When she first saw the baby, she almost fainted. She immediately understood who the father was. She was afraid that Chuck, a brunette, wouldn't believe her. So she came up with a story about her grandmother in advance. How would he check? He wouldn't. And she wasn't going to raise the daughter herself. Whether she grows up with red or brown hair, or even multicolored, it doesn't matter anymore. In late September, Chuck worked down the street, pushing a stroller. Clara was asleep, and she sent him out with their daughter. Blue-eyed, red-haired Kim was fast asleep in the stroller. Every day Chuck stared at her face, searching for something that might remind him of his features. Sometimes he thought the fingers or the nose looked similar, but more often, he realized he just wanted to convince himself. Pain grew in his soul. He tried to push away dark thoughts, but they kept creeping into his mind. Chuck walked onto the boulevard, scanning for an available bench. He strolled along the path past flower beds. Suddenly, a dog's bark was followed by a cheerful voice. Linda, come here. Come to me. A large dog with light fur and intelligent brown eyes bounded out from behind the trees. It stopped, joyfully panting. Chuck frowned, looking towards its owner, frozen in place. Standing by the bench with a leash in hand was a teenager. Next to him was a tall man holding a woman's hand. In that woman, Chuck recognized Delilah. She didn't notice him because she was only looking at her companion, who had his arm around her waist. Chuck clearly saw Delilah's rounded belly. The man's hand glided over it too. Delilah laughed happily and leaned her head on his shoulder. The dog bounded towards them, wagging its tail and jumping. Delilah tousled the boy's hair. Then they turned away, and all three slowly walked along the alley. Delilah held onto the man's hand as if afraid to fall behind. Chuck stood there for a long time, watching them. Kim cried in the stroller. Chuck shifted his gaze to her, gave the girl a pacifier, and, occasionally looking back,